Welcome back to Welcome back to Woke Nation. This is the next episode in my series on addiction. I wanted to do a number of episodes that kind of deal with my experiences on addiction. I already put out the first episode, which was just more or less a kind of a broad overview of my story, as it were. I just basically gave you a running, quick briefing of how I started experimenting with drugs and where that all led me, and the progression of it, starting out as a very simple thing, just kind of trying a few substances here and there, and then it eventually taking over my life and degrading everything about myself to the point where I ended up in rehab on two separate occasions. And like the first episode, this episode will also be on video on YouTube. I'm going to try to be doing that from now on with my podcast episodes because it just reaches more people that way. More people get on YouTube and watch videos um, than they do podcast episodes, and not many people get on YouTube and listen to audio tracks. So this is better, I think. But anyway, I also kind of delved into the reasons for why I ended up addicted to drugs and using them and abusing them in every way possible, and why there was multiple substances and all that kind of stuff. Um, so in these next couple episodes, I want to kind of explore what addiction is and how and why it manifests itself in certain people's lives. Now, there's a lot of different kinds of addictions that can take hold in people's lives these days. It doesn't just have to be drugs. People can be addicted to gambling. There's Gamblers Anonymous. People can be addicted to pornography. I don't think there's any pornographers or anonymous groups, but there should be because of the damage that addiction actually does to people's marriages, to their families, to their sense of self. It erodes your respect for women. There's a whole host of different ways that it, like any addiction, that it's progressive in its degradation of your sense of self, your morality, your relationship with God and family. Addiction, no matter what kind of addiction it is going to progressively destroy these things. But there's addiction to money, there's addiction to fame, there's addiction to power, there's addiction to food, uh, to social media. A lot of people today are addicted to social media, and from what I've heard, I haven't done a whole lot of study on it, but from what I've heard, there's scientists or psychologists and others that are looking into this. There's books being written now on the effects that this addiction to social media has, and how when people put videos or pictures on, say, Instagram, there's a release of endorphins. There's endorphins that get released in your brain when you look on Instagram and see the number of likes that say a picture that you posted have gotten. It gives you the same chemical release that a hit of dope does, albeit not as powerful, but it's the same idea, the same rush you get when you say win a pot in poker. It's the same idea, the release of endorphins, which necessarily begins the chemical dependence in your body upon whatever it is that you're doing. And that's how it begins. And you begin chasing that. That's why with heroin they say it's chasing the dragon. That's when opium was big in the 1800s in Victorian era England. They had the Chinese immigrants come in and they had opium dens there because opium was big in China because of the English. They had the opium wars where they forced the Chinese to grow and use opium basically, and the Chinese were well aware of the detrimental effects of the drug on their society, and they didn't want it, but that's what those wars were about, the British forcing them to continue to grow and sell opium because they were making so much money off of it. But anyway, when the Chinese immigrated over to Britain, they had their little colonies, their little Chinatowns, I guess in London, for example, and they would set up opium dens, which were known to the to proper society as dens of vice and not of virtue. But this addiction that would happen from opium, they would call it chasing the dragon. That's what they call chasing the high, chasing the dragon. And there were other they back in those days, of course, they were not aware of how detrimental and how addictive certain substances could be. So if you had a cold or a back pain, they would prescribe you laudanum, which is liquid opium. And, it took them a long while to realize the devastating effects that this was having and how easy it was to get addicted to these drugs. So it's actually, in a sense, there's an argument that can be made that addiction in its rawest form is not predicated on whether you have the addict's gene or whatever, or whether you're predisposed towards addiction, but there's a legitimate argument I think that can be made about whether or not it's a measure of exposure. A lot of addicts today are older senior citizens in America here who are prescribed medication like Oxycontin or Opanas or what have you, or Percocets, and not told how addictive they are. And they're prescribed them by doctors who are just pill happy, as they call them. And it's not till later that these older people who had no history with addiction or drug abuse in the past are now actual addicts. So it's a complex thing. But what I want to address, because I want to keep this centered around myself, because I think there is value in telling your past experience so that others can learn from it. And it's one way for me to kind of like process myself what I have learned from it. Because let's face it, the world society, American society, is so fast paced that there's very little time today for any kind of self reflection. There's very little time that people have today to work on themselves, to better themselves, to search deep within, and perhaps find things that they love or like or dislike or want to change about themselves. And yet we are told that that is the ultimate good, you yourself. So it's kind of ironic that our society is totally built against that, and yet we're told that that is the road to fulfillment. Anyway, what I wanted to talk about in this episode now, and what I want to focus on, is one of the things that really drove me into the arms of addiction, you could say, which is contentment, not being content. I think this is a huge problem in our country today, and it was with myself, keeping it on me. When I looked at, from my earliest days, I just always, for some reason, had this idea that because I like traveling, I enjoy traveling, I love other cultures, I like experiencing different areas and the way people live, and just the culture of a different area, a different way of life, all those kinds of things. And so I was always obsessed with the idea of traveling, and even when I was really little, I remember I'd be running around in my backyard, and I could stand on a hill sometimes and see over into there was another street called Parsons Road that ran behind our neighborhood, and I could kind of see down onto that street a little bit. I could see the telephone poles and the trees, and I used to just wonder, what's going on over there? There was just this sense of mystery about it, and I always had that feeling about different places and different areas. But it started to grow from just this wondering about what those places were like to this idea that if I was there, then I would be happy. So there was always this idea that I had that if I could just change my location, change my circumstances, change my place, that I would be content, I would be happy, that I would be satisfied, and I could live a normal life. And this idea grew in me very rapidly throughout my teenage years, and as I approached the point of of graduating high school, I started to look into colleges, and every college I looked at I live in Pennsylvania, was across the country: California, Florida, the Virgin Islands, Papua New Guinea, if I could have done it, if there was a college there. I could have gotten my my PhD in headhunting with some of the tribes in New Guinea. If there was such a degree, I would have gone for it. I wanted to get as far away from where I grew up as possible, because I had in my head I had this idea in my head that the farther I went away, the happier I would be. As if distance can create happiness. Distance is relative to where you are. So how can you grow objective happiness off of some relative measurement like that? It's just foolish. But I had that stuck in my head, and a lot of things grew out of that. Once you have that as your baseline for thought, that where you are is what is at fault, then I started to look around me, and no matter what I saw, no matter what was going on in my area or in my life, I viewed it negatively. Um, and I just, I remember just, I don't know, it was paralyzing too, because I didn't, I guess it was because deep down at some point, on some level, I knew this not to be true. I knew that just moving somewhere wasn't going to make me happy. I had to have known that. And so I never made any kind of move whatsoever, because I would think, well, if I would want to move to New Orleans, or I would want to move to Florida, or I would want to move to California. And yet I thought to myself, if I'm in California, what if I'm not happy there, but I would be happy in New Orleans? So I never went to either of them. And I know this sounds kind of crazy talking about it, but in truth, that's kind of the way my thought process was. And so I became paralyzed by this also, because I knew somehow on a deep level that just moving wasn't going to make me happy, you know. And it wasn't only just my location, but it was also my job as well. I painted in construction for 10 years, um, which isn't, there's no, it's kind of a boring job. It doesn't, you're not going to, it's not a career path. You can't retire from being a painter usually, unless you're in a union, I suppose. But I would think to myself, if I had a different job, I would be happy. Um, but the problem was the same as the traveling issue is, if I go there to this other company, or this other work, this other mode of work, then maybe I won't be happy there, so I should have gone over here. And I just ended up doing none of it. Um, and it was very self-defeating to think this way. Always thinking that if I had just something different than what I have now, then I'll be happy. This elusive, it's like clutching after air. Like you really can't put your finger on what's making you unhappy, at the time at least, but yet you're in this desperate struggle to find it anyway. Very hard to explain. I don't know if I'm doing a good job, like putting my finger on it, as it were, or explaining it, but that's kind of how my thought process was, is that like I had this idea that if I went here or changed this or changed that, that I would be happy, that I would be content, that I would be satisfied, that I would have found what I was looking for. Um, but since I didn't know what that was or where it was, I ended up doing nothing. I never went to college as far as like a university is concerned. I went to a community college, which to me was like, why would I go to a community college? I looked down on them. So I only lasted maybe like a half a semester or maybe one semester. I took a couple math courses and basically left. Never went back. So I've never gone through college, which I sort of regret, sort of don't. But, it just, there was always this deep feeling of like unhappiness and a lack of satisfaction with just the littlest things that were given to me. And I think what's at the root of not being content is ingratitude. And you can see that in the Bible quite a bit. I believe, anybody who's listened to my podcast know that I believe in the Bible. I'm Christian. And I believe that what we have in life is a gift from God. Our blessings are gifts from God, all of them, from the smallest thing to the biggest. And so what I was not acknowledging was that everything I did have was a gift, and so I should have been thankful for it. I was not thankful in any way, shape, or form. I think this contentment issue also, beyond being unthankful, there's a good deal of pride also, kind of, I think, wrapped into it. I think it would be pride, because it's like this side of you that's saying that the world or God owes you something, that what he's given you isn't enough, and that you should have more. For some reason, he owes you more. And it's a wonder to me that inkling ever snaked its way or wormed its way into my brain and into my outlook on life, because I was not raised to think that. I was raised to be thankful for what we have. But somewhere along the line, and a lot of that was because I stopped reading the Bible, I stopped going to church, I started looking at at life in a very more secularized way, and this is what came of it. You know, if you look at society today, it's not hard to see that everything that, and perhaps this is where it came from for me. Perhaps it was, is that I stopped reading the Bible, stopped having a foundation, a good moral foundation, Christian foundation for my life, and instead I started looking to the world. And what do you see in the world? If you look right now at pop culture, or the Christian church, for that matter, the popular Christian church, everything is based off of material possessions, that you will be happy if you have this product on TV or that product. The Rolling Stones wrote a great song about it way back in the 1960s called Satisfaction. I can't get no satisfaction. And they list a whole number of products that are getting shoved down your throat. Like, if you can't be a man if you don't smoke the same cigarettes as me. You know, the way pop culture just tells you what you should be like. And if you don't have a foundation outside of that, outside of pop culture, it's very easy to believe the lies that they tell you. I think spending time on social media, which I still do, but I did at that time too, further compounded the problem for me, in that while I was going through this time of a total lack of contentment and satisfaction, I would also get on Facebook, and Facebook is very deceptive because you only see what people want you to see on Facebook. You go onto somebody's profile, they may have just gotten arrested for a DUI, spent 3 days in jail, and just gotten out, and their girlfriend left them, their parents hate them and threw them out of the house. But if they don't post about it, you have no idea. While that's all going on, they may have just gotten accepted into Harvard, and getting accepted into Harvard was the only thing they chose to post about. So that's the only thing you think is going on in their world. So it's very deceptive. So I would get onto Facebook and all these things, and while I'm going through this dissatisfaction, I would see that seemingly, I found out that this isn't the case later on, but seemingly a lot of people's lives were advancing in ways that they wanted them to advance. They seemed to have something I didn't have, which was happiness, success, contentment. But another big problem too was that I didn't know how to value those things. I didn't know how to measure them. I say that these people I was looking at had contentment. Well, how do you measure that? How do I know that they're content? Off of what do I base that? What is my measurement for it? What is the definition that I would use for contentment? Obviously, my definition of contentment was very skewed at the time. Success is also another thing. Our culture tries to tell us what success should look like. It's more money, it's fame, it's women hanging out off of you if you're a guy. It's a nice car out in the street in front of your house. It's a bigger house than your neighbor has. It's always better that relative to the person standing next to you. Just like the old joke where if you and your friend are being chased by a bear, they ask you, how fast do you have to run? Well, you don't have to outrun the bear. You just have to outrun your friend. And so this measure of happiness in our culture and contentment is not really based off of an objective truth like the Bible say. or Proverbs, which is in the Bible, but rather you'll be content and happy as long as you outdo the guy next to you. um, as long as you, like the famous phrase, as long as you keep up with the Joneses. And I think that was a, for me, I can't talk for anybody else. Hope I just knocked the microphone. I hope, if this is on podcast, I hope nobody heard that. It'll sound like a gun going off. I don't have a gun. Um, but yeah, keeping up with the Joneses. That's what it's all about today. And I started getting that into my head. This desperation to somehow, and when I would meet family members or friends over Thanksgiving, people would come back to the area. Keep in mind that I'm using drugs through this whole time period, and so I didn't have money to move out of my parents' house. I'm in my mid and then getting up to my late 20s, still living in my parents' house in the same neighborhood that I grew up in the past 30 some years, or 28, whatever. Friends have moved on, and around Thanksgiving, Christmas, they come back to visit their family, their parents, and so I see them then, and there's this deep. I measure myself up towards them. They've moved on, they've moved out of the neighborhood, they went to college, they're working in Alaska, they're going to Vietnam, like my one friend. Whose name I won't mention, but or they're on a hiking expedition on the what's that trail that goes up from the entire country? I can't think of it right now. Appalachian Trail. They're hiking the They're doing all these things, and that's another problem too. Is I was looking at things, at physical things that I saw that they had that I didn't. Um, and who knows, if society is to be anything to be judged off of its results. We have a very high suicide rate now, and yet we have more things in this country than we've ever had before. We're the most prosperous nation in the world, and yet our life expectancy is dwindling because things are not making us happy. Drug abuse and opiate overdoses are going through the roof. I think it was like 40, 50,000 a year. More people are dying from that than anything else in the country, except maybe heart disease. But the two are not mutually exclusive either. You take a heroin every day, all day, and you don't take care of yourself, you can get heart disease. But yeah, our culture is surrounded by this idea, because they've cast off spiritual truth, that owning this or owning that is going to bring you happiness and fulfillment, and that in and of itself is also an addiction. Addiction, I think, is, as I said in a previous episode, the best physical image, physical reality that you could use to describe original sin, or just our addiction, our bondage to sin that you have before you're saved, before you trust in Christ. This total bondage to sin, and it manifests itself not just in addiction, but also in the blind chasing after things that deep down you have to know will not fulfill you. Everybody has in them a hole that they try to fill with one thing or another. You could say that's their idol. Um, you could say that it's their idol. That's what they chase after. And an idol is your God, and that's what you place on the throne in your heart. And for me, it was contentment. It was myself, really. And if you worship yourself, you're going to come up short every time, no matter what. I know I did. I did. Um, I found that to be an exercise in futility. Um, and even when I did travel, there were different times when I would get money together, and yeah, I remember my cousins and I went on a road trip down to, we went to Nashville, Tennessee, we went to Birmingham, Alabama to visit my aunt and uncle, Raleigh, North Carolina, uh, we were in Atlanta, Georgia also. We visit Charlotte, North Carolina, which I will maintain is the cleanest city that I've ever been to. But we went to all these places, you know. on a road trip, you would think that that would have made me at least content and happy for a little while. Here I am saying that if I could only travel, I would be happy. But it didn't. The first thing that I did, and this is crazy, the first thing that I did when I got back from that road trip, while before we were even back, we were riding in my cousin's car. We were getting close to like Wilmington, Delaware, and I didn't have my car, so I couldn't just drive there. But I was already texting people, trying to line something up, to get some pills or whatever. It didn't happen to pan out that night. So the following morning, I took off work and I went down to Wilmington, Delaware. Because I hadn't done anything in a while, I it hit me a lot harder than it normally did, and I was all drowsy and nodding out, as they call it. And I get in my truck, and because again I'm nodding out, I crashed and totaled my truck. So yeah, there I am without a truck, getting driven back by the people I ran into. They were kind enough to drive me back to my parents' house, and there I am without a truck. The end result of my dogged pursuit of contentment, which got me nowhere yet again. Here I am with the little things that I should have been grateful for and valuing, like a truck, a car, which we all take for granted but is actually valuable. And here I am tossing it away, just stupidly. Um, so yeah, this was a big problem for me. Contentment, not being satisfied with the things that I have. The Bible also talks about the way God gives gifts, and what He gives you to what does it say? To him who He has given much, much is expected. There's a measure of responsibility there, in that I think God does test you a little bit by giving you some responsibility, some things to take care of, and to be thankful for. He'll bless you in a way, possibly to test you, to see if you will be thankful for those blessings. And if you're not, how can you expect more? How can you expect more blessings if you're not thankful for the little things that you're given? I have on my phone here, so on podcasts you won't see it, but I apologize. I'm going to be looking down at my phone for a second here, because I found some verses about contentment that I think are important. And if I had read them sooner in my life, it probably would have saved me a lot of misery and heartache and headache. But as my dad told me a long time ago, you learn, he was talking about me, learn through the school of hard knocks. And he was right. I'm not going to deny that. But either way, I did learn quite a bit from my experiences. Before I read these verses, just real quick, to how I am now and to how I look at life then is like night and day. When I went into rehab for the last time, Lord willing, the last time. I don't like to presuppose anything, but right. Um, it was common ground in Harrisburg, which is kind of where I live now. I live near there, near Harrisburg, the capital city of PA. But anyway, when I went in there, I remember like everyone talks about, you have to surrender, and I did do that. Now, I'm not going to say like it was just me falling on my knees and deathly tears and just full repentance and a total, it was an incremental thing, how I changed, and how I think God used things in life to change me to how I should be, how He would want me to be. These things happened incrementally over my time through rehab, through the halfway house that I was in after that for 3 months, the recovery house I was in for 3 months after that, and then my wife now then getting pregnant, and that whole situation, the stress that came about through her pregnancy, the medication she was on. These are things that I'm going to get into in the next episode, because as I said, I'm going to make a series out of this, because I think again, these issues of contentment and addiction and all the themes that come out of addiction, hope, salvation, repentance, a turning away from what you did formerly, the new creature, all these things, how you can go from something that low and turn your life around. More people need to hear that because the real hope is not usually heard anymore in our society. You know, you're told lies, I think, in a lot of ways, and I'm going to address a lot of that in the next videos. Um, but I do want to say that as far as contentment goes, you know, just as an example, very recently here, we're renting a house right now. There's my wife, and then we have our son, who's he's 3, 4, 5 years old. I don't want to get specific because there's nuts on the internet sometimes. Um, but you know, I've been working in cable for the past couple years, and just the cable, to anybody that knows anything about that industry, people are streaming more and more now. People aren't getting using cable boxes as much as they used to. They're not paying for cable. You know, when I first started there, I would go to an install, and people would be getting 6, 7 cable boxes. You know, some people got them in their bathrooms and 2 in their bedrooms. You know, it was nuts. Well, it's not like that anymore because more people stream now to save money. Netflix, Hulu, YouTube, Pandora, iHeartRadio. The list is endless. So the money is not as good as it was anymore, and we were going through a time where money was super tight, you know, very tight, to where I was like, how are we even going to pay our bills? And at the time, my wife was not working, so it was very stressful. Um, but the way I approached it now, and this isn't to talk myself up in any way or say, oh, look at me, I know how to do things the right way now, or like I'm some righteous guy. That's not what I mean at all. But I only to show the change that can take place, and a better way to look at things as far as like being content. So here we are in this very tight situation, you know, it was stressful. But the way I tried to really approach it when I prayed about the situation, you know, praying that there would somehow be more money because she was looking for another job. You know, I was praying, you know, provide a job for her, for my wife, provide a job for me that pays more. But even in the midst of that, I made a point of always being thankful and thanking God for the things that we did have, the fact that we do have a house, the fact that I do have a job, the fact that we're healthy, the fact that we're happy, the fact that we have these things, these nice things, and each other, because it'd be very easy for any number of those things to be taken away. And so gratitude is a big part of being content and being thankful for what you do have. Um, and so that was a big deal. When I did that, I noticed a huge shift also in the way I responded to stress. In the past, stress would just overwhelm me, and I couldn't think about anything else. If something wasn't right in my life, then something was stressful or stressing me out, then I didn't have the ability to compartmentalize that and well, you know, everything else is generally good. No, I just let that ruin everything, you know, and so that doesn't happen as much anymore because I realize that something that you're stressed out about is not the whole picture. You have so much more going on in your life always that you can be thankful for. And it is important to always focus on that, to be thankful and content with what you do have. And as long as you are, you'll find that that is a huge change in the way that you view life and just on how life feels to you. Not to make emotion the primary thing here, but it's like a weight was lifted in a lot of ways off my shoulder in the way I look at life. I don't dwell on the stress anymore. That mean that I never get stressed? No, but I always try to remind myself of the things that I do have and where I've come from and where I am now, and the fact that I really don't deserve to be here now. It's that gratitude and that contentment and that thankfulness that kind of drives me now, rather than the stress and the anxiety and this gnawing feeling that if I just went somewhere else I would be happy. Well, there's the old adage that they always tell you in rehab, because I would tell them sometimes, well, I just need to move, I just need to get out of my area and I'll be okay. Well, they would always tell me, and rightly so, that no matter where you go, you take yourself. So if you're not content, while you're in Pennsylvania. You're not going to be content when you're in New Orleans or Nashville, or you could move to freaking Key West. Think of your nirvana, your heaven. If you go there carrying with you an ingratitude, an ungrateful spirit, and you're somebody who's not thankful and not content with what you do have, then you're not going to change just because you go somewhere else. You're fooling yourself if you think that, just the way I fooled myself for years. Um, so yeah, I'm going to read a couple verses and then we'll kind of close this out. But contentment is obviously the main focus of this. And it was a big part of what kind of drove me. And anytime I think about my past experiences with addiction, it seems like I come up with a new perspective, almost not necessarily a new perspective, but I think to myself, oh, that was something else that kind of contributed to. So it was my entire worldview that was just skewed, and contentment was part of it. I'm going to address others in the next episode next week. And then later on, I also want to talk about the actual rehab system as it is, and kind of talk about how I think that could be better, because I think there's a lot about it that just agitates and creates repeat offenders, for a lack of a better term. And we'll get into that in future episodes. I want to focus on contentment. So I'm going to read a couple verses and then we'll kind of close this out. So that's what I'm doing here while I'm looking down at my phone. But anyway, this is Matthew 6:25 through 26. And it says, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they?" Matthew 6:32 through 33, "For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you." Let's see here. There's a whole list here. This is from BibleStudyTools.com. Philippians 4:12 through 13. "I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength." And just a couple more, maybe one or two more. This is Hebrews 13:5. "Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, 'Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you.'" And that's probably the best one so far. Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. And lastly, we'll close on this one. Or two more actually. The second one's really good too. 1 Timothy 6:6 through 7. "But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it." I think if a lot more people heard and really thought about that verse, 1 Timothy 6:6 through 7, "But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it." And lastly, Luke 12:15. "Then he said to them, 'Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions.'" So we'll close on that one. But yeah, that was kind of my episode and my thoughts on contentment, which was a big thing for me. And I think anybody that truly has been through addiction would have to say that contentment, being content, or the struggle to be content, the pursuing of contentment without really knowing what it is. Because if you knew what it was, you wouldn't have been an addict. You could argue, but I think that if we're honest, that this is something that has really driven a lot of the addiction in our country, and it was for me. But there were better things waiting for me on the other side of that. Um, we're going to get into there's going to be another episode in my series on addiction next week. So I hope you'll tune in. Um, all these episodes will, as you see now, be on YouTube in video form, as well as iTunes. So subscribe to both my YouTube channel and the iTunes podcast. I'm really starting to try to get these to grow now at this point, now that I'm kind of got an idea of where I want to go with the podcast and the YouTube channel, which are basically one and the same in a lot of ways. Um, but anyway, good night, and God be with you.